Welcome to Not Just a Transaction, the podcast series hosted by experienced real estate authorities Nick Prefontaine and Zachary Beach. Each week, the hosts bring you expert guests to help you navigate the many creative options available for buying or selling a home, while cutting out the costly hurdles of a conventional real estate deal.
Hey everybody, this is Zachary Beach and Nick Prefontaine with another episode of Not Just a Transaction podcast. You are lucky enough here today to hear from the better looking brother-in-law. And today we actually have an amazing guest and a good friend of ours, attorney Rob Romano. I think it's the first time I've ever called you attorney Rob Romano. But today, Rob Romano's got 27 years in the service of helping families, particularly in the South Shore and in Massachusetts, help them achieve their financial goals. He is also a fully dedicated estate planner and helps families protect their assets. So we thought it was so important to have Rob on today's podcast because on this podcast, we help both buyers and sellers. But as the buyers get to a point where they're able to qualify for their own loans and buy their own property, well, it's really important to make sure that you're doing your correct estate planning. So with that brief introduction, Rob, welcome, my man.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks, Nick. I appreciate you guys having me on. It's good to see you guys, and I appreciate you having me on to shed a little light on some things here for your students and listeners.
Absolutely.
Rob, welcome to the show. Just give our listeners in your words, what it is you do, other than the lovely introduction that Princess Zach read earlier. You can go into tell the listeners about who you are.
That was a lovely intro, and Zach couldn't have done much better if I had written it myself. So,
I'm pretty sure you did write that intro.
Right off my website. Anyway, so I am Rob Romano. I am an estate planning attorney. That's all I do as an attorney. My background in a nutshell is the first half of my career was spent as a financial advisor. So I started that about 30 years ago and enjoyed people help build their wealth through financial planning and traditional investments. But in the late 90s, I saw a couple of families lose everything to a nursing home and some other problems when people didn't have proper estate plans. So that kind of triggered me to go back to law school and learn estate planning. So in an effort to help people preserve and protect their wealth and what they've built for themselves and their families. So I did that. And so for the past 15 years, all I've done is work as an estate planning attorney. And again, the goal of that is just to make sure people's wishes get carried out correctly and their wealth is transferred to their families correctly in case, God forbid, something happens to any of us, which we all know is going to happen at some point. Hopefully it's later rather than sooner, but in this crazy world, nobody knows. So it's important to have things set up correctly. So in your world, you guys obviously do a great job with all kinds of real estate transactions, buying and selling, and all kinds of creative things that you do. So I would counsel, even before we get into the real estate stuff, I would counsel everyone listening to make sure you do have some type of estate plan and have something in place just in case something happens. And so that means not only for your properties, but also for everything else that you have, for your bank accounts, your investment accounts, your IRAs. Those traditional type of accounts can be transferred via just having beneficiaries on those accounts. So, that's an easy way to do it. A lot of people will have things in a trust, and that's another way to do it. But the one asset that you really can't have beneficiaries on is property. So for all you guys out there buying and selling or holding or have investment properties, that's really one of the most important things you have to look at in your estate plan is what would happen if you die? What's going to happen to those properties? So obviously there's different ways to hold properties. That would be the first thing to look at, and speak with an attorney and make sure you are setting things up in the best way for yourself, both to transact business if you're buying and selling, like to keep that money liquid and available. Also for tax purposes, the tax ramifications of how you hold the properties, and in selling them, it makes a difference, obviously, whether you hold it in an individual name, if it's in a partnership, if it's an LLC, if it's in a trust. there's different ramifications for all those things. So you want to take a look at, what the options are and what may be the best way for you to own it. And that obviously falls into the estate planning realm. All those different ways that you can own it, you also have to make sure that whether it's a partnership agreement, if it's an LLC, if it's in a trust, you want specific provisions of what happens to things in that entity or what happens to those properties or each property if you die. And that's really one of the most important things I do with my estate planning is helping people figure out what the best way to own property is. And it's probably even more paramount for you guys, where a lot of my clients are, regular mom and pops that have maybe just their single family home. They have one property, or they might be lucky enough to have a vacation home, but they have maybe two properties. You guys have, buying and selling multiple properties or holding multiple properties. It's even more paramount that you look at how you're holding these properties and have that in your estate plan so that it's the best of all worlds. Making sure you have flexibility to use that money if you need it, the best way to hold it as an entity for tax purposes, and the best way to transfer it if something were to happen to you, and have rules of what happens to each property as well if you were to pass away.
Hey, Rob, that just because the majority of our listeners are going to be those mom and pops right now. So tell us, what would be, if you give anybody some piece of advice right now, like what's the number one mistake that you see your average Joe or somebody that's just going to buy their first home or maybe is now owned, their vacation home and their single family home? What's the number one mistake that you see people make that you're helping them fix?
Number one mistake is probably just holding property in their own name. The reason is if you die with property in your own name, so if it's a married couple like husband and wife, most husband and wives will own property jointly. So that's not as bad, right? If husband dies, wife as a joint owner would then still own the property. So then wife would be the sole owner. But if they both died, then it's a problem. Or if you have single folks, single gentleman buys his first home, it's just in his name. If he dies, then because there's no beneficiary on that property, because you can't have a beneficiary on property, that property would have to go through probate. So biggest mistake is if there's a property in your own name and you die, that property has to go through probate. Probate in a nutshell is just a waste of time and money. It's a court process. It costs thousands of dollars. It can tie up property for 6 months to a year. And, nobody wants that for either reason. So that's the first mistake, is having it go through probate, But the second problem I see equally as important is when you just have property in your own name and you don't have, say, a trust. That's the most common vehicle I use. There's no rules in place as far as what happens to that property after you die. So like, for instance, at my average couple, it's, a mom and pop that has their single family home. And let's say they have 3 children and they have wills, and their wills say, if one of us dies, husband dies, I leave everything to my wife if she's living, otherwise to my 3 kids equally. So husband dies first, wife now has the property in her name. Now she dies, her will says it goes to the 3 kids equally. The problem with that is the 3 kids now own the price equally. So they all own 1/3 of the house. If you're looking, I'm looking at you guys, you can see where I'm going with this, and the listeners probably do already. But when you own 1/3 of a house, that means you have 3 votes. And, what happens if all 3 don't agree? One wants to sell it. One of the kids always needs the money. One wants to sell it. One might want to keep it, especially if it's a vacation home. And maybe one of the other kids is down on their luck and they may want to live there. And of course, that's going to be free, and who knows how long they're going to stay. So all kinds of problems can develop in that situation. So the way I solve that is I set up a trust, and in the trust, you can make rules. So same family, put the house in the trust, and the trust says, the trust is really, people get confused by the trust. The trust is really your own written rule book. It's just a bunch of rules of, this is what happens while I'm living. This is what happens if I get sick. This is what happens after I die. Basically telling your family how things are going to go. And then those rules have to be carried out by law. So these parents would say, after we're both gone, children, this is what you're going to do with the property. And then they can say in the trust, the property will just be sold, for instance, and then the money will be split 3 ways. So now the kids can't argue about it. It's already done. The parents laid down the law in the trust. Or if they want to be a little more flexible, they can say the kids can all vote on what they want to do with the property. And they can do whatever they want with it. They can keep it, rent it, sell it, live there, share it, whatever they want to do. But I always put the caveat in, key phrase. Most attorneys don't do this, but I always do. And it says, at the end of that rule, so long as they all agree. So if all three kids are on the same page, then great, they can work it out on their own. But then I say, okay, rule 2. If the kids don't all agree, we as parents don't want you fighting. So we're going to break the problem. We're going to solve the problem, even though we're not here anymore. We're still parents breaking up the kids fighting. And so rule 2 usually says something like, if you don't agree, then the property will be sold. If one or more of the kids want it, they can have the first right of refusal to buy out the other kids. And if nobody wants it or whatever, if they can't do it that way or they don't want to do it that way, then it will be sold on the open market. So I always do that, and it basically prevents the kids from fighting, essentially, because kids can't get mad at each other because it's mom and dad's rules. And
they've already passed on. So what are they going to do? Curse their parents in the grave?
Yeah. So you lead me right into my favorite joke of the classes I teach, Nick. So I say, if the kids aren't happy with your rules, mom and dad, guess what? You're not here. You don't have to listen to them for a change. I don't know if you guys can all see me on the podcast, but I'm covering my ears because obviously you died. You're not here. So the kids aren't happy with your rules. You don't have to listen to it. But
it's not always the most pleasant thing to talk about, Rob. People passing on, and no one likes to talk about the uncomfortable. But we actually just had one of our original high six associates that we work with out in Pennsylvania. He actually just passed away last week. So it's gonna happen to everyone. You can't outrun Father Time, and it's good to set this stuff up.
Well, I'm sitting here as a listener, Robin. You're going through this process, and it obviously makes a ton of sense. It's like, okay, like let's not complicate things. Let's write out what we want to happen. Like, why don't you think more people do that?
Well, first, I'm sorry to hear about your high six member. I know it's been a tough year or more with a lot of people passing away, whether through COVID or other things. So, I'm sorry to hear that for you guys and your smart coach and other pre-family people that you guys are dealing with. I think the biggest reason people don't do it is that they just don't know any better. Like, there's still a big misconception out there that people think estate planning means getting a will. Like, I have people call me all the time. Yeah, Attorney Romano, I got referred to you. I need to have a will. And that's just like, that's what our parents did. That's what our grandparents did is, oh yeah, you need to get a will, for what happens when you die. But most people just use that term generically. Like, they think that's what estate planning is getting a will. They just don't know it's a lot more complicated than that, such as having just a will means that things will still go through probate. When you don't have a house in your own name, as I said earlier, and you just have a will, well, that will has to go through probate. So you're still looking at that thousands and thousands of dollars of expenses and 6 to 12-month waiting period. They don't know better that nowadays the more modern way to have an estate plan is to have a trust instead of a will. So I just think the trust education hasn't gone mainstream where, by the time your kids are a little older, Zach, hopefully they won't be saying, hey, we need to get a will someday. Hopefully things will have progressed to say, hey, I need to get a trust now. Like, hopefully trust will be replacing wills. So it'll be more commonplace. But that's why I teach a lot of classes and I try to get the word out. When people hear the differences between wills and trusts, and I explain them thoroughly, people almost all the time, unless they have a very, very simple situation, will opt to get a trust, especially for properties, to make sure that properties don't have to go through probate. And as I said earlier, so that there'll be rules associated with each property. Earlier, I'll just say one more thing, is that you had mentioned some clients or some folks that may be listening have vacation properties. Vacation properties are even more important to have rules. If it's a single family home, let's say this couple I mentioned with the 3 kids, let's say the kids are older, the kids are all in their 40s and they're married and the parents in their 60s and 70s. Well, if those parents pass away, the kids may not need the parents' residence because they're all grown and gone and they have their own families and their own houses. But if they have a second home on Cape Cod or in Newport that's been the summer place that the whole family uses, and now the parents are gone, you really need rules for what happens to that second home, because in my experience, some of the kids use the property, some don't, or who's going to get July 4th week, who's going to pay all the expenses, if you rent it out a little bit, who's collecting the rent, who's doing the management of the property. All that stuff needs to be set out in the trust so that the kids know what's happening with the vacation property as well.
I just have one other question, and I want to make sure that we don't forget to, because you do teach classes, so I want to make sure, and you're a wealth of knowledge. Because I mean, Nick and I would say is relatively young, but we have trusts and wills set up. Like, when do you believe that people should start like this process?
Okay, so I'll try to answer this briefly. I usually tell people there's 3 kind of phases of estate planning, or 3 maybe different times you should think about it. The first phase is when you're young or you have young children. So let's say a young couple, like choose you for example, Zach. Let's say it's a roughly 30-year-old couple, has a couple of young kids. Okay, at a minimum, you need to have wills with guardianship provisions that say, God forbid, husband and wife get hit by the proverbial bus. Who's going to raise the kids? Who's going to look out for the kids as far as with our money, provide for them, manage the assets for the kids, that stuff, and have kind of a basic estate plan with a will, power of attorney, healthcare proxy, like the basic documents. So when you're young and you don't have a lot of assets, you need to at least have that will with guardianship provisions. That's what I call phase 1. Then as you start to get a little older and you start to get more assets, especially properties. So this could be in your 30s, could be in your 40s, could be your 50s. At some point when you get more assets, and it depends what state you're in. If you're in Massachusetts and you have more than $1 million and you're married, you need to have a trust, or else you're going to have estate tax, Massachusetts estate taxes. So as your wealth grows, if you own properties, then at some point, phase 2 means you should have a trust. And at this point, it would be a revocable trust. So you still have access to all the assets, but in a revocable trust, you can still make all those rules and you can still avoid probate, and it will also help you with estate taxes. So at whatever age that is, as you get more assets or you get some properties, you're probably going to want a revocable trust. And then phase 3 usually becomes around retirement age, 60 plus, so 60, 65, 70. The conversation shifts to, okay, I'm older now. I'm not Superman anymore when I was 30. I'm 65 or 70. There's a chance I could get sick, and God forbid I could end up in a nursing home. How do I preserve and protect what I have so that I don't lose all my assets if I get sick? So that starts to shift the conversation into preserving and protecting what you have. We often use irrevocable trust, but you can't do that until, around retirement age. So phase 1, when you're young couple, get the basics in place, especially for your young children. Phase 2, when you start to get a little money or properties, get a revocable trust. And then phase 3, when you're older, get into the preserve and protect what you have mode.
Love it. No, love the depth of knowledge there. Nick, why don't you go ahead and ask your favorite question as we wrap up this podcast?
Well, Rob, I can tell you've done this once or twice before. You're very knowledgeable.
Actually, I just read a Cliff Notes book at 10:15, but I got a pretty good memory.
Yeah, you stayed at a Holiday Inn once?
Yeah, and they left the lights on for me too.
Well, I think most importantly, our listeners want to know, they're dying to know the question, why is it not just a transaction to you? In other words, why do you give a shit?
Well, I'll tell you, as I said earlier, I started out in my career about 30 years ago doing financial planning and helping people save for retirement and invest, managing their money and investments. And I thought that was great. I'd get people a great rate of return or put their money in a great investment and they made all this money. But on the flip side, as I said, in the late 90s, I saw a couple of families lose all their money because they got sick and went to a nursing home and didn't have things protected. So for me, that's why I shifted over to the legal side. I just became very passionate about trying to help people preserve and protect their life savings. Because let's face it, we all work hard. You guys on your side, I know you're doing, everybody's making their calls, everybody's hustling, everybody's trying to do deals, everybody's fighting to build wealth for themselves and their families. You don't work 30, 40, 50 years of busting your butt and not have anything set up. And then God forbid somebody has a stroke or gets in an accident, goes into a nursing home, and then poof, everything's gone and there's nothing left to show for 40 or 50 years worth of hard work. So having seen that, I just said, this is wrong. People shouldn't get wiped out. So that's why I shifted over to help people preserve and protect what they have. And that's what I'm all about. So as you can tell, I'm kind of fired up. I'm a little bit passionate about what I do. And I just don't think it's right that people can lose everything to the government or to the nursing home, whether it's to a nursing home or to the government in taxes, when it can be easily avoided just by setting up the right type of estate planning and tax planning. It's just kind of common sense, but not everybody knows they need to do this, or people are so busy working that they don't think of this, especially when they're younger. They think they're young and like, I don't have to worry about dying, but they really should, just as, protecting worst case scenario, having this stuff in place just in case something happens to make sure your family will get most or all of what you've worked hard for.
So it's true, Rob, that you were actually blonde before you switched over to this side of the attorney business, and that's why your hair is now red, because you're always fired up.
Yeah. As long as you don't call me Heat Miser, we're still friends, Zach.
Don't worry, I'll never call you that. But what we can do is make sure that the listeners can get a hold of you, especially if they're in Massachusetts. I know that's who you work with particular. So I want to make sure that they can get a hold of you. And the best way to do so, I believe you told me, was for them to email you at rromano@robertromanolaw.com. We will make sure that that is in the show notes, so that way you can go ahead and reach out to Rob. Rob, it was a pleasure having you on this podcast. And I was writing down, or I was thinking through my trust and my will and all of that. So I got some stuff to do now. So thank you. And I appreciate you being on.
Yeah, well, it's great to see you guys. Great to see both of you. Please tell the rest of the family I said hello, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And as you said, if any of your listeners have a question or want to speak with me, I'm happy to talk to you. And as you said, I'm only licensed in Massachusetts, so unfortunately I can only help Massachusetts residents, but I know that's a lot of your the folks listening. If you are out of state, I'd suggest you contact a local estate planning attorney in your own state. And I do know some in other states, so if you need a referral, you could also reach out to me that way too, but otherwise just find one locally.
Well, thank you, Rob. It's always a pleasure to connect with you. And I really think you shared a lot of good information with the listeners today. So stay tuned, everyone, for next week's episode, where we're diving in further into the home buyers and sellers podcast, not just a transaction. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks, guys. Continued success.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Not Just a Transaction. If you want to learn more on selling a home, buying a home, or resources to learn more, head on over to our website at originalre.com.